In 1879, a man walked into the small mining town of Cardiff, Pennsylvania, and nobody could agree on what to do with him. Not because he was dangerous, not because he had done anything wrong, but because he was 9 feet and 4 inches tall, weighed somewhere in the range of 800 pounds, and could not fit through a single doorway in town. He stood in the street outside the general store for the better part of an afternoon, while the townspeople gathered, some of them whispering, some of them openly staring. One woman reportedly covering her children's eyes as though what she was seeing was obscene rather than simply impossible. His name, as best as anyone could record it, was Aurelius. He spoke in a dialect that no one present fully recognized, though fragments of what he said were pieced together later by a local school teacher named Harold Voss, who had studied classical Latin and claimed the man's speech bore traces of something far older than anything he had encountered in his academic career. Voss wrote down what he could in a personal journal that would not surface for another 112 years. Within 4 days of his arrival, a team of men arrived by train from somewhere east of Pittsburgh. They were well dressed. They carried official-looking documents. They spoke quietly with the town's mayor for less than an hour, and then Aurelius was loaded onto a modified flat car, covered with canvas, and taken away. No official record of this event exists in any government archive. What Aurelius said before they loaded him onto that train is the reason we are here today. The world you were taught about in school has a foundation poured in the 19th century, and if you dig beneath it, you find a layer that does not match the official story at all. It is denser, older, and full of structures that should not exist given the timeline we have been handed. The more you pull at this thread, the more the fabric unravels. Giants are not mythology. They are not metaphor. They are a suppressed chapter of human history that powerful institutions have spent over a century and a half, quietly, methodically, and very deliberately erasing. Aurelius was not the first, he was not the last, but what makes his case different from every other giant account that has surfaced, been dismissed and been buried again, is this: someone was there to write down what he said. And what Harold Voss recorded in that journal, in cramped handwriting on pages gone yellow with age, is either the most important testimony in modern history, or the most elaborate and accidental invention of a grieving, isolated schoolteacher who died forgotten in 1901. You are going to hear both sides of that argument, and then you are going to decide for yourself. To understand Aurelius, you have to understand the world he appears to have come from. Not the world of 1879, the world before the Reset. Researchers in the alternative history community have spent decades trying to reconstruct what they call the Tartarian civilization, a global empire of staggering sophistication that they believe was violently erased from the historical record sometime in the 18th or early 19th century. The evidence they point to is everywhere once you know how to look for it. Those enormous government buildings in Washington, the cathedrals of Europe, the train stations of the American Midwest that are far too grand for the populations that supposedly built them. Buildings with windows that begin at what appears to be the second floor but descend into the earth, suggesting that the ground level we stand on today is not the original ground level at all. Old photographs that show buildings half buried in what appears to be compacted sediment. Street-level views from the 1860s and 1870s that show the lower portions of buildings already underground. The mud flood theory holds that sometime in the early to mid-19th century, a cataclysmic event buried the lower portions of an existing advanced civilization. The survivors, or the people who replaced them, either could not or did not want to acknowledge what they had found. So they built on top of it. They invented a history that explained the grand structures around them without requiring anyone to ask uncomfortable questions about who had actually built them and why they were designed for occupants significantly larger than the average human being. Doorways that measure 12 feet tall, ceilings that soar to 20 and 25 feet in buildings supposedly constructed for ordinary commerce, chairs and thrones and lecterns in old institutions that are photographed with adult humans sitting in them dwarfed. The proportions do not fit unless you accept that the architects were building for someone else. That is the world Aurelius came from. Harold Voss's journal was discovered in 2001 by a woman named Patricia Emmons, who was cleaning out a house in rural Pennsylvania that had belonged to a distant relative. She did not know what she had found for several years. Voss's handwriting was difficult, his abbreviations inconsistent, and the early sections of the journal read like the mundane daily observations of a lonely man marking time in a small town. But beginning on a date he records as the 14th of September 1879, the entries change completely. Voss writes that he had been called to the street by his neighbour, that there was a commotion near the general store, and that he arrived to find a crowd of perhaps 40 people standing in a loose semicircle around a figure he describes with almost clinical precision. He notes the height first, estimating it at 3 times his own, then notes the build, which he describes as proportional rather than deformed, suggesting this was not gigantism in the medical sense, but simply a human being of a different scale. He notes the clothing, which he describes as strange, layered, and of materials he could not immediately identify. He notes the boots, which he estimates could hold 2 ordinary men standing side by side. And he notes the face, which he describes as calm, ancient, and deeply tired. What Voss had that nobody else present had was a partial knowledge of classical languages. He writes that when Aurelius began to speak, most of the crowd heard only noise, a deep resonant sound and a register that several witnesses later said they felt in their chests rather than heard with their ears. But Voss heard something else underneath the unfamiliar cadences. He heard roots, he heard word shapes he recognized from his studies. Not Latin exactly, not Greek exactly, but something that had given rise to both. He moved closer. He asked the giant in Latin if he could understand him. And Aurelius, according to Voss, turned and looked at him for a long moment and then replied. Not in Latin, but in something close enough that Voss could follow the broad shape of it, the way a Spanish speaker might follow Portuguese, if both parties spoke slowly and chose simple words. What Aurelius said, reconstructed across several journal entries in which Voss clearly revisits and revises his translation, was this. He said that he had been walking for a very long time. He said that everything he had known was now beneath the ground. He said that his people, whom he referred to with a term Voss translates alternately as the tall ones or the first builders, had not died all at once. They had diminished. They had gone into the earth, some of them willingly, some of them not. He said the covering had come quickly in some places and slowly in others, and that there had been fire and water and a darkness that lasted longer than any winter he had known. He said he had been asleep. He said that when he woke, the world above looked like something built by children, using the ruins of their parents' home as raw material. He did not say this with contempt. Voss is careful to note that he said it with something more like sorrow. He said that he had walked toward the sound of people because he was the last one. He said there were no others like him still walking. Some had been taken by the men in fine clothes who had come before. Others had found the places in the earth where the old world was still preserved and had gone back down into them and would not come up again. He had considered this himself, but he was too old and too tired, and he wanted to see what the world had become before he was finished with it. He said he had a message to deliver. This is where Voss's translation becomes most difficult and most contested. The specific term Aurelius uses for message is one Voss renders in several different ways across 3 separate entries, as though he is not satisfied with any single English equivalent. He tries warning, he tries inheritance, he tries finally a phrase. What the fathers leave at the door when the sons are not yet ready to receive it. The message, as Voss records it, was this. Aurelius said that what was buried was not dead. He said the structures remained, the foundations remained, the knowledge encoded in stone and proportion and alignment remained, and that it would all surface again when the sediment allowed it, or when someone with the memory to read it chose to dig. He said that the institutions gathering his kind were not doing so to understand them. They were doing so to ensure that nothing he carried, no knowledge, no proportion, no language, no living proof that the official story was incomplete, could reach anyone willing to listen. He said that the men in fine clothes had told him he would be studied, which he understood to mean silenced in a way that produced paperwork. He said he was not afraid. He said that the children, meaning everyone present, meaning everyone alive in that century and every century that would follow, had built on top of something magnificent without knowing it. that they walked over doorways every day that led to rooms full of light and craft and a depth of accumulated knowledge that dwarfed anything in the institutions they had built on top of the ruins. He said the tragedy was not that the old world had been buried. The tragedy was that the new world had been convinced there had been nothing there before. He said, "Remember that the ground is not the beginning. The ground is where someone else stopped." 4 days later, the men from the east arrived. Voss did not speak with them. He watched from his window as they consulted with Mayor Aldous Crane for the better part of an evening, then crossed the street to where Aurelius had been sleeping in the open field behind the feed store, too large to be accommodated anywhere under a roof. He writes that Aurelius stood when they approached and did not resist and did not appear surprised, that he looked once in the direction of Voss's house before he turned and walked with them toward the train. Voss writes that he felt the footsteps through the floor of his house. He writes that he counted them. He writes that there were 41 before he could no longer feel them. The train left before dawn. Now. Before you dismiss Harold Voss as a fantasist, consider what surrounds his account. The Smithsonian Institution was founded in 1846. By the 1870s and 1880s, it had developed an aggressive field acquisition program that dispatched agents across the American continent to collect, catalogue, and transport anything of anthropological significance. Newspaper archives from the latter half of the 19th century contain hundreds of reports of giant skeletal remains being uncovered by farmers, miners, and railroad construction crews. These reports are not fringe publications. They appear in the New York Times, the Chicago Tribune, the Smithsonian's own early bulletins. Skeletons measured at 7 feet, 8 feet, 9 feet, and in a handful of accounts beyond 10 feet. Skulls with double rows of teeth, bones that crumbled on exposure to air, sites that were documented and then went silent. In virtually every case, the subsequent trail goes cold. The bones were reportedly sent to the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has no record of them. The local records from the sites were often lost in fires, floods, or simple administrative dissolution. The newspapers that reported the finds moved on to other news, and the official history of human habitation on the American continent proceeded as though none of it had happened. In 2014, a lawsuit was filed in the United States against the Smithsonian Institution by a coalition of alternative researchers and historians demanding transparency regarding giant skeletal remains allegedly held in storage or destroyed. The case was dismissed. The institution maintained it had no such remains and no record of ever acquiring them. The dismissal was not accompanied by any independently verified audit of the Smithsonian's holdings. There are currently over 56 million objects in the Smithsonian's collections. Fewer than 1% of them are on public display. The storage facilities are not open to independent researchers. This is not conspiracy theory. This is institutional architecture. The question of what is being stored and what is being suppressed is not paranoia. It is a reasonable question to ask of any institution that collects on a massive scale, operates with government funding, and answers to no external audit body regarding the contents of its off-display holdings. Now consider the buildings. Any researcher seriously engaging with the Tartarian material will tell you that the most compelling evidence is not the giant accounts. Those can be dismissed as hoaxes, misidentifications, or exaggerations. The most compelling evidence is the built environment itself, and specifically the problem of scale. When you look at the original buildings of Washington, D.C., the early state capitals, the grand train stations of cities like St. Louis and Cincinnati and Buffalo, the customs houses, the post offices, the banks of the mid-19th century, you find a consistent architectural vocabulary of enormous scale that does not correspond to the population density or economic output of the communities in which these buildings appear. A train station in a Midwestern city of 12,000 people with a ceiling height of 80 feet and a main hall large enough to comfortably hold 4,000 people standing. A customs house in a port town with marble floors, columns 40 feet tall, and an interior that would not look out of place in imperial Rome. Who built these? More pressingly, who did they build them for? The standard answer is civic ambition. Boosters of the 19th century built big because they believed in a future of massive population growth and wanted their institutions to grow into their architecture. This is plausible for some cases. It becomes less plausible when you notice that many of these buildings were constructed not from scratch, but appear to have been adapted, restored, or completed from existing structures that predate the official construction dates. Researchers have identified dozens of cases where buildings supposedly constructed in the 1840s through 1870s contain foundation stones, basement walls, and subgrade structural elements that show weathering inconsistent with their official age, where the joinery and masonry of the lower portions differs from the upper portions in technique, material, and quality, where the lower portions are, invariably, superior. The mudflood interpretation of this evidence holds that crews in the mid-19th century did not build these structures. They excavated them, repaired them, completed them where they had been left unfinished, and then presented them to the public as new construction. The documentary record of the period supports a remarkable amount of construction activity at precisely the time and in precisely the locations where the anomalies cluster. The alternative history interpretation of that documentary record is not that it was fabricated, wholesale, but that it was a cover story layered over a recovery operation. Recovery of what? Recovery of the Tartarian world, the civilization of the tall ones. The term Tartaria itself comes from medieval and early modern European maps. Tartaria, or Tartary, appears on virtually every major world map produced between the 13th and 18th centuries as a vast empire occupying the central and northern regions of the Eurasian landmass. It is labelled, it is bordered, it has cities named within it, and then, with extraordinary speed, it vanishes from the cartographic record in the early 19th century. Not gradually, not through a documented series of conquests and political transitions, it simply disappears from the maps, replaced by the patchwork of nations and territories we recognize today, with no official historical accounting for what it was, what happened to it, or where its people went. Academic historians treat Tartaria as a loose geographic designation, rather than a unified empire, a catch-all term applied by European cartographers to the largely unmapped territories east of the Urals. This is the consensus view, but it requires accepting that every major cartographic institution in Europe, independently and over a span of 5 centuries, consistently labelled a geographic zone that did not constitute a political entity, that they gave it a name, gave it internal city names, gave it the visual weight of empire on their maps purely as a matter of convention, and that when it stopped being a convention in the early 1800s, no one wrote down why. That absence of explanation is, for researchers in this field, as significant as any physical evidence. Harold Voss died in 1901. He had no children. His house was sold, his belongings dispersed, and his journal appears to have passed through at least 3 sets of hands before coming to rest in the box of papers that Patricia Emmons inherited, along with a farmhouse she had never seen. She donated the journal to a small local historical society in 2004, where it sat in an archival box for another 11 years before a graduate student named Daniel Chow, researching 19th century rural Pennsylvania for a completely unrelated thesis on agricultural economics, pulled it off the shelf and read it over the course of an afternoon. Chow did not know what to do with what he found. He was not in a field that intersected with alternative history research. He was not, by his own account, a person inclined toward conspiratorial thinking. He was a young man interested in crop rotation records and land valuation trends, but he recognized that what he was reading was either a remarkable document or a remarkable forgery, and he was honest enough with himself to admit he lacked the expertise to determine which. He photographed every page. He shared the images with a colleague who had expertise in 19th century American handwriting analysis. He shared them with a historian who specialized in the period. He shared them eventually, and somewhat reluctantly, with a researcher in the alternative history community who had been documenting giant accounts for nearly 2 decades. The handwriting analyst confirmed that the journal was consistent with mid to late 19th century American handwriting styles and showed no signs of being produced in imitation of that style by a later hand. The historian confirmed that the environmental details Voss includes throughout the journal, the names of local businesses, the references to weather patterns, the offhand mentions of regional news events, were all consistent with verified records of Cardiff, Pennsylvania in the fall of 1879. Neither of them could confirm what Voss had seen or whether Aurelius had existed, but they could not dismiss the journal as a modern fabrication. The alternative history researcher, whose name is not included here at their own request, spent 6 months cross-referencing Voss's account against newspaper archives from Pennsylvania and the surrounding states. What they found was this. There is no direct coverage of Aurelius in any newspaper they could locate, but there are 3 separate brief mentions in 3 separate small Pennsylvania newspapers from September and October of 1879 of unusual rail traffic passing through stations in the region, described variously as oversized freight, a special shipment, and, in the most evocative phrase, a consignment of considerable dimensions requiring special accommodation. None of these mentions are accompanied by further detail. All 3 occur within the window of time consistent with Voss's account of the train that left before dawn. There is also a single entry in the correspondence records of Mayor Aldous Crane of Cardiff, who did maintain a record of official correspondence and whose papers are archived at the local historical society. The entry is dated September 18, 1879, and reads in its entirety, "Visitors from the institution. Matter resolved. No further action required. The institution, not an institution, not any institution, the institution, as though whoever was receiving Crane's correspondence would know immediately and without additional context which institution he meant." Patricia Emmons, when interviewed about the journal, said that she had spent a long time trying to understand why someone would make this up. She is not a researcher. She is not an advocate for any particular theory. She is a retired schoolteacher from Pennsylvania who found something strange in a dead relative's house and handed it over to a historical society because she thought that was the right thing to do. She said, "I keep coming back to how sad it sounds. Not frightening. Sad. Like someone writing down the last words of something that knew it was ending." That description is difficult to argue with when you read Voss's account of Aurelius directly. Whatever you believe about the reality behind the account, whatever you believe about giants and buried civilizations and suppressed histories, the portrait Voss draws is of a being that has outlived everything that gave his existence meaning. The language he uses, the language Voss translates haltingly and imperfectly from something far older than Latin, is not the language of a monster or a wonder or a threat. It is the language of a witness. He was the last one walking. And he walked toward people not because he wanted to be seen, but because he had something to say, and there was no one left from his own world to say it to. Remember that the ground is not the beginning. The ground is where someone else stopped. There is a school of thought within the alternative history community that interprets this as a literal instruction, that Aurelius was telling whoever would listen to dig, that the buried world of Tartaria is not a metaphor or a myth, but a physical reality accessible through the earth beneath our feet, beneath our cities, beneath the foundations of buildings that were not built for us, but that we have been handed and told to call our own. There are people who have spent years attempting to act on this instruction. Urban explorers, amateur archaeologists, independent researchers who have descended into basements and sub-basements and tunnels beneath major American and European cities, and found, in some cases, exactly the kind of anomalies that the theory would predict. Rooms that do not appear on any architectural plan, corridors that lead to sealed walls of a construction style inconsistent with anything built in the last 2 centuries, proportions that suggest the original occupants were not the same size as the people who currently walk the floors above. Some of these explorations are documented. Some of the documentation is credible, some of it is not. The challenge of the Tartaria material in general is that it exists in a space where the signal and the noise are genuinely difficult to separate. Because the institutions that would normally serve as arbiters of what is real and what is not, the universities, the archaeological establishment, the governmental heritage bodies, are precisely the institutions that the theory holds to be complicit in the suppression. This is not a comfortable epistemic position to be in. It requires holding genuine uncertainty without resolving it prematurely in either direction, neither dismissing everything because it conflicts with consensus, nor accepting everything because it conflicts with consensus. The people who have done the most rigorous work in this field are the ones who are most honest about the limits of what the evidence currently proves. What the evidence currently proves is this. Enormous buildings of unknown origin or anomalous construction exist at scale across the world. Newspaper records from the 19th century document the discovery of giant skeletal remains at a frequency that is inconsistent with simple hoax or misidentification. The Smithsonian Institution and its equivalents in other countries conducted aggressive collection programs during exactly the period in which these discoveries cluster and have no verifiable public record of what was collected. A vast territory called Tartaria appears on European maps for 5 centuries and disappears from the cartographic record in the early 19th century without documented explanation. A journal written by a school teacher in Pennsylvania in 1879 describes a 9-foot man who spoke a language older than Latin and said that the world beneath our feet was built by people we have been taught to forget. None of this proves the Tartaria theory. All of it is consistent with it. Harold Voss closed his September 22nd entry, the last entry he wrote about Aurelius, with a sentence that Patricia Emmons said she has thought about almost every day since she first read it. Voss writes, "I do not know what I have witnessed. I know only that I was the one present who could hear him, and that what he said was too large for the town to hold, and that when the train carried him away, I felt something leave the world that will not return in my lifetime or in any lifetime I am able to imagine." The alternative history community will tell you that Aurelius was not alone, that the suppression of giant remains is ongoing, documented in dozens of credible accounts from researchers who have traced skeletal discoveries to institutional acquisition and subsequent disappearance. That the mud flood evidence is hiding in plain sight in the architecture of every major American and European city, in the subgrade windows, in the anomalous proportions in the foundations that are too fine for the structures they support. That Tartaria was real, that its people were real, that the reset was real, and that we are living in the ruins of a world we have been forbidden to remember. The academic establishment will tell you that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence that the newspaper accounts of giant remains are the product of a credulous 19th century press, with no rigorous fact-checking standards, that the architectural anomalies have mundane explanations, that Tartaria was never a unified political entity, and that a single uncorroborated journal found in a farmhouse box is not evidence of anything except the richness of human imagination. Both of these positions are honest representations of how their holders understand the available evidence, and both of them have been held with equal conviction and unequal access to the physical record for a very long time. The gap between them is not primarily a gap in intelligence or rigor, it is a gap in what each side is permitted by the institutions they operate within or outside of to seriously consider. That asymmetry is worth sitting with before you decide which set of conclusions to trust. The question you need to ask is not which side is right in every detail. The question you need to ask is which side has more to lose from being wrong. If the alternative history community is wrong, the consequence is a collection of interesting but ultimately unfounded theories held by a community of passionate researchers. If the academic and institutional consensus is wrong, the consequence is that an entire chapter of human history, the chapter that would explain who built the grand structures we inhabit, who left the bones that were quietly acquired and quietly disappeared, what the men in fine clothes were so determined to silence when they came for Aurelius in the fall of 1879, has been deliberately and systematically erased from the record of who we are and where we came from. Remember that the ground is not the beginning. The ground is where someone else stopped. Aurelius said that, or Harold Voss heard something like it in a language older than Latin, and wrote down the closest thing he could reach. Either way, someone left it at the door. The question is whether anyone is ready to pick it up. If this is the kind of history that keeps you awake, the kind that lives in the gap between what we are told and what the evidence suggests, then you are exactly who this channel exists for. There is more. There is always more. Subscribe so you do not miss what is coming next, because the next stone we lift has something underneath it, and it is considerably older than anyone official is prepared to admit.